My parents' house is right on the bend of a long, open country road. Often I would wake inside my futon in the middle of the night, and there would be hundreds of presences coming down the road. In hushed, whispering voices, they would say things that I couldn't catch, slowly walking along, filling the width of the road. I instinctively knew, however, that I mustn't look at the procession. The first thing I thought when I received a half-broken camera from my father was, what would happen if I used this to take a photo of the procession without looking directly at it? In the end, I never enacted the plan. But if I had taken a photo, what would have appeared in it? Shibata Makoto grew up in the small town of Nomi, Ishikawa. In 1970, only 30,000 people lived there, and the town had only one high school. Like many in the 70s and 80s, he grew up in an old-fashioned Showa-era house, with sliding doors and thin wooden walls, which took on a more horrific aspect at night. From a young age, Shibata Makoto was convinced he was experiencing the supernatural, that he was coming into contact with ghosts. One of his earliest memories is the sound of a parade of spirits on the road to the shrine outside his house. But it didn't stop there. Unexplained sights and sounds, horrifying dreams, unsettling atmospheres, and ghostly voices haunted his youth. And over time, his terror and fear transformed into a complex admiration for the world just outside our reach. It's not strange to believe in ghosts in Japan. The belief in spirits is built into the religious tradition that dominates the Japanese consciousness, Shintoism. A preoccupation with death defines it, and many of its rituals are concerned solely with warding away the dead, cleansing those who come into contact with the dead, and appeasing their spirits. But while believing may not be uncommon, seeing and believing, and telling others about it, certainly was. But that's who Shibata Makoto was, a young man with a strange fascination with the supernatural, eager to tell most anyone he could about it. When he left home and headed further inland to attend the University of Toyama in the early 90s, the ghosts and spirits seemed to stay behind. But while he may have moved on, he never forgot the supernatural world he'd glimpsed in his youth. One day, he would bring that world into ours, and he wouldn't do it alone. Kikuchi Kisuke was born in March 1973, likely in the Shizuoka prefecture of Japan, where he attended high school. He had an early interest in mathematics that led him to attend the Tokyo University of Science, where he studied algebra, graduating in 1994. He was quickly hired by Tecmo, a video game company established in the 60s, which was in the middle of transitioning from arcade games to the new console market of the 1990s. Kikuchi was one of many new hires who entered into a training group before being assigned to his first game, and it was in that group he first met his new coworker, Shibata Makoto. Kikuchi, as a programmer, was assigned to work on Tecmo Super Bowl III after his training ended, while Shibata's role was game testing on Mega Man Legends. But sometime in late 1994 or early 1995, the two of them found themselves reunited. The game was Deception, the first in what would become a long-running series for Tecmo. It was centered upon using traps to defeat enemies. It was a first-person story-driven game focused on vengeance, and its popularity would spawn half a dozen sequels over the next decades. Kikuchi Kisuke was a central programmer for the first and second Deception games, before receiving a promotion to project manager for the third. Shibata Makoto began as a game planner for the first, and then main planner for the second and director for the third. The two of them were gaining experience and influence, and their trajectories brought their working careers closer and closer together. They presumably became rather close during this time, close enough that Shibata would pitch his own original ideas for games he wanted to make to Kikuchi, who then helped him research and imagine said ideas. Since Deception is a series focused on setting traps, architecture is an important element of its development, considering the layout and design of the building is important to developing the game itself. So, Kikuchi Kisuke spent a lot of time researching architecture. The games had always been styled after Western medieval castles, but Kikuchi had wanted to use Japanese architecture. He researched the topic and alongside Shibata prepared a proposal for a Deception game set in a Japanese locale. Unfortunately, there was a major technical hurdle in their way. Historical Japanese architecture is incredibly detailed and stylized, far too much for the PlayStation to emulate. By comparison, the blocky gray castle walls of Western history were easier to create, so the research had to be set aside. But it wasn't forgotten. By the end of Deception 3, Shibata had photo books full of reference material, and the desire to create a game in a Japanese setting hadn't faded from either of their minds. What Shibata Makoto wanted most, of course, was to create a horror game. He pitched Kikuchi the idea of a game focused on ghosts, an element he felt horror games had overlooked until then, and the two began developing the concept not long after the Deception 3 project finished, sometime around 1999. First and foremost, they had to consider how to create a ghost in a video game. Working with the PlayStation made this hard. Once again, the limitations of the console restricted them, and the duo agreed that their ghost would have to appear primarily in CG. They just couldn't imagine how to create a frightening, realistic ghost in the blockier, pixelated graphics of the in-game engine. Shibata, after all, had very specific ideas of how ghosts should look. He'd seen them, and his goal was to recreate his own spiritual experiences as closely as possible to allow those who couldn't see the spirit world to experience what it was like to be haunted. Luckily for the duo, it wasn't long into their project that the PlayStation 2 was announced. The new console was far more powerful than its predecessor. To Shibata, it was as if the stars had aligned. This console would be able to truly express the vagueness of ghosts, as Shibata described them, using the Emotion Engine. Levels of graphical capability that had been restricted to pre-rendered cutscenes on the PS1 could appear in-game on the PS2. The player would be able to walk through a nightmarish world of spirits. In their previous projects, Kikuchi and Shibata had used frightening things, alongside more entertaining and comedic elements to create the atmosphere of Deception. It wasn't truly a horror game, but an action game with horrific elements. This time, the focus would be on pure fear. The time was right. The advent of a new console capable of better graphics seemed like the perfect time for Kikuchi and Shibata to set Deception aside for a while and work on their new concept. Centered upon two ideas, it would be a game that used Japanese historical architecture and featured the spirits of the dead. Since they would be starting from nothing, the new project was given the working title of Project Zero. Shibata would be the director, Kikuchi the producer. And the team who would create the game, most of them former members of the Deception team, would be called the Project Zero team. One of the most central of these team members would be Toshiyuki Takasaki, a game programmer who joined Tecmo in 1993. He was part of the Deception team, a programmer for 2 and chief programmer for 3. He would continue in that role for Fatal Frame, working very closely with the director to create the atmosphere and visual effects of their world. Another was Hasegawa Hitoshi, called Zin in the game's credits. Hasegawa attended the Tokyo Design College and graduated in 1995, before beginning his career working on 2D fighting games at ADK in April of that year. It was, unfortunately, a bad time to be moving into the 2D career path. He started working with 3D graphics and was eventually hired by Tecmo in January of 1999. He worked on character models for Deception 3, and was officially the character design creator for Fatal Frame, a role that would grow and expand with time. Another artist working with him was Shidara Masahiro. As an aspiring college student trying to decide his future, he remembered a time in his childhood when he won an art contest. It occurred to him he could major in art. Once he graduated, he joined Tecmo in 1999 and would design the interface of Fatal Frame. There were many others, such as Inari Daisuke, who helped create the pre-rendered films of the game, and Shibata Kohei, who joined Tecmo in 1998. Deception 3 was his first game. For Fatal Frame, he would be in charge of the motion team that would bring the characters and ghosts to life. While they all had different backgrounds, what they had in common was a future heavily tied to Fatal Frame, a game series that would propel them into leadership roles, entrepreneurship, and lifelong gaming careers. To create a game centered upon fear, they would have to develop what their concept of fear really was. So producer Kikuchi asked director Shibata, what was the most frightening thing to him? Shibata answered, people's imaginations. As a child, he was far more frightened of what he couldn't see than what he could. He would tell a story as an example, describing a time his friend invited him to see the movie The Ring, which his friend claimed was terrifying. While waiting to see it, Shibata built the film up in his mind as something truly horrific. Too afraid to see it, he and his friend decided to see a different movie, and that night, Shibata had the scariest nightmare he'd ever had. True fear comes from what people imagine in their head, how they work themselves up over what could be there, rather than what is there. While Kikuchi wasn't a big fan of horror or fear, once he took on the project, he had ambition. He wanted to go farther, to do more than had been done in horror before. You could emulate what books and movies did in the genre, but if all you did was create something frightening to look at, it would be meaningless to consider it a game. They had to make it so the player would be scared to touch the controller. That was the starting point for Project Zero. Shibata would develop the design document, a work which was in part revealed almost 2 decades later, during a talk Shibata gave at the 3rd Nico Nico Games Conference. The document presented their world of the game, a historical Japanese mansion on a mountainside, a third of which had actually been modernized into a more Western-style building. That idea would prove too ambitious for the team, and the section would be cut. The idea behind the mansion was simple. Japanese historical buildings are structured in a way that's more frightening than most. And since the intended audience for the game was Japanese, Shibata felt that a game that felt close to home, rather than in a country far away, would be far scarier. In his lecture on the subject, Shibata joked about being terrified of his parents' house, telling his listeners to explore their own ancestral homes, to understand how frightening they are. Large, empty spaces, sliding doors that are partially see-through, structures that cast all kinds of shadows. The style of the building lends itself well to fear, in the way it emphasizes shadow and emptiness. The game would use a grainy and faded appearance pulled from films from the 1970s, and alongside the use of a flashlight, would create a different experience compared to most of the clear-edged and clean PS2 games at the time. It would make full use of the PS2's graphic ability and its stereophonic sound, allowing the player to experience what it's like to be inside a haunted house. The document also presented the ghosts as enemies, explaining them as spiritual beings who weren't truly to be defeated so much as struggled against. They were not villains or monsters per se, they were the departed, who were already dead and cannot be killed again. The idea was very different compared to other horror games of the time, but Project Zero had some luck on its side. This was the early years of the horror boom that saw Japanese horror and ghost stories in particular taking the country and the world by storm. It wasn't so strange to imagine a Japanese ghost as an enemy after the popularity of Sadako and the horrors of The Grudge. That was Shibata's goal, to recreate the experience of a Japanese ghost movie. The problem was that in these kinds of films, the ghosts often don't directly appear until the last act. Their game would have to have a lot more spirits, and a system to interact with and combat them, and that was a hurdle they would struggle with. The original design document explains Shibata's original idea. The camera, referred to as the ghost capture system, the design was meant to capture ghosts via taking pictures, stealing their energy in the photograph. In the East, photographs and cameras have long been associated with the occult, and there are multiple folk stories that claim cameras can steal your spirit. Spirit photography itself had been popular in Japan for a few decades before, and most of all, the camera required the player to look at the ghosts. It was to be a game that specializes in scares at all costs, one that would be easy to operate and provide a truly scary experience, appealing to the average person and the avid horror fan. One weakness of horror from the time was the fact that the monsters and enemies had to be run from. Even in games like Resident Evil, the gameplay emphasizes keeping your distance and staying away as much as possible to survive. The player is never really made to face and engage with monsters head-on. In Shibata's concept, the player would have to not only look at the ghosts, but even wait with bated breath for the right moment to engage with them, essentially forcing them to stand still and let the ghosts come to them, while looking directly at them. The game concept was approved. Shibata would later credit multiple reasons for why his strange and unique idea managed to leap that first hurdle. The early 2000s were a great time for horror in the East and West, with Ring and Ju-on coming from Japan, and the Blair Witch Project making waves from the other side of the ocean. These films would become phenomenons in their home countries and abroad, revealing just how explosive and popular horror projects could be, especially horror with ghosts. In the game world, it was Silent Hill's success that Shibata Makoto credits with his game getting the green light. Silent Hill had been a 3D game using polygon-created horrors, in Shibata's words, which players really enjoyed. That success paved the way for his ambitious proposal, but not every element of said proposal accepted without critique. Kikuchi Kisuke's first thought upon seeing the design document was, "Seriously?" He was clearly surprised, and not entirely sold on its every idea. But he did feel one element was solid. Japanese houses were well suited to horror. The shadows cast by screen doors, the decking with its hidden compartments. He felt the two of them could create a game scarier than anything the world had seen before with this idea. The horror of Japanese houses described in Shibata's own words. Japanese houses are spaces that have their own unique charm. They are divided by fragile materials such as wood and paper doors. There are lots of hiding places. Behind folding screens, under the floor, atop the crisscrossing beams. On the other side of a lattice, a warm darkness resides everywhere. Japanese houses are made from living materials. It seems to me the emotions of the people who have been there have seeped into these wooden Japanese houses. When I immerse myself in that darkness, I feel as though the memories of the deceased are secretly whispering to me. As you explore the rooms thoroughly, wondering what happened there, I want you to listen out for whispers from the darkness. Other elements of the proposal, however, were not so universally liked, and one of them would be a constant struggle: the system of combat. The first hurdle was the weapon itself. Kikuchi was not a fan of the camera. He didn't understand how it could be considered a weapon, and others on the team agreed with him. So other options were explored. Character designer Hasegawa originally imagined the main character as wielding magic in one hand and a sword in the other. Traditional Japanese exorcism tools such as ofuda and sacred arrows were imagined as weapons as well. Even a vacuum similar to Luigi's mansion, or stunning them with the light of the flashlight, or using a magic shouting skill that pushed ghosts away with your voice, were all considered as options. Kikuchi felt that the system had to include an attack on the ghost with some kind of weapon, or else it wouldn't really feel like an exorcism. Cameras aren't intuitive. People understand swords or bows, they make sense as weapons, but the idea of a camera being used to attack doesn't immediately make sense to the average person. But nothing else was working, and Shibata was insistent on his camera concept. In his attempts to explain his ideas, Shibata described the concept to his team as Resident Evil meets Pokemon Snap. Apparently he was half joking, but the comparison stuck. Eventually, he went so far as to make a mock-up of his idea, presenting it as a style of gun combat that could only shoot a single bullet at a time. He wanted their combat to be built on the idea of staying up close until the last second, withstanding the fear and defeating it, and only the camera could truly implement that idea. The camera obscura, as it was known in the West, became the game's weapon. In Japanese, it would be known as the shaiki, or shadow-destroying device. The name was meant to sound a bit dated and foreign, putting it in a specific time period, the Meiji and Edo periods, when Japan was importing foreign devices and technology. They used countless references of real devices of the kind when designing their own camera, which was based on a real camera, the German Linhof 5x4, but was remodeled to suit the game's atmosphere and give it a more Japanese feeling. It was also designed to be a folding camera, so it would make more sense the player could walk around and carry it easily. The history and development of the camera was originally part of the plot, but it would be cut for time. The problem was, even if the camera was the most interesting weapon, the question of how to make it function as a weapon remained. They had to have a system of combat. A sword is intuitive. You swing the blade, strike the enemy, and deal damage. How does a camera deal damage? How do you measure the damage? The mechanics of the idea didn't shape up easily. It was a very messy process, one that younger members of the team would eventually help clean up. Specifically, Shidara Masahiro. Shidara's official role as interface designer meant he was behind the creation of the game's menus and overlays, but stories from interviews imply he had a much larger impact on Fatal Frame. Shidara was longtime friends with fellow Fatal Frame artist Hasegawa Hitoshi. The two of them were assigned to the same team early in their Tecmo careers, and they shared their frustrations with their superiors together. The 90s were a tough time for video games. The switch from 2D to 3D, from arcade-focused to console-based, was a major hurdle for most developers, especially the older folks who had been raised and trained on outdated techniques. Older employees found themselves going to their juniors for assistance, and the juniors found themselves overwhelmed with more responsibilities and work than was normal. Hasegawa would remember that during this time, he and Shidara were often frustrated with their superiors' ways of doing things, and they'd step up and do the work themselves to see it done. The more they proved they could do the work, the more work and responsibility they were given. Shidara recalls in an interview a time when he was working on the UI for a game, and how he wasn't happy with the battle system his seniors had created. So he created something alongside a senior programmer around his age, a prototype combat system focused on charged shots. The timeline, the various stories, and even the term charged shots all point at Fatal Frame as the project Shidara and his programmer friend developed the prototype for. His story doesn't specifically say camera combat, but Fatal Frame uses a system that includes holding the shot to charge it up and do more damage. Shidara says his work on that combat project was adopted, and after that he was invited to every meeting of the planning staff, though he was a designer, not a planner, and he was suddenly entrusted with work beyond my capacity. In fact, Shidara and Hasegawa would both become central to the world of Fatal Frame. Hasegawa's role would move beyond character concepts and into the difficult maneuvering behind the atmosphere and color palette of the game. Originally, the game was entirely in shades of black and white. It was intense, creating stark contrasts between light and shadow. Balancing these colors was a careful game. If it was too dark, the player couldn't see and move forward. Too bright, and it wasn't frightening. Hasegawa hadn't realized how detailed this job would be when he began. Shadows were just shadows, right? It was director Shibata Makoto who showed him just how nuanced and detailed shadows could be. Working alongside him, the director and Hasegawa carefully perfected the balance of black to white, shadow to light in the game. It was during the process of discovering this balance that Hasegawa and Shibata realized that full black and white was too much. For one, it made the experience more intense, causing slowdown that made the enemies move in jerky, violent motions, which made it much more frightening. When producer Kikuchi and even Shibata himself reacted with fear, they knew they'd gone too far. The answer that Hasegawa and Shibata developed was to limit the black and white to specific scenes, the flashbacks and cutscenes involving heavy ghost activity, creating a special atmosphere and intensity in those scenes. It was one of the few changes the team made from Shibata's original proposal. In fact, getting him to change anything was difficult, according to Kikuchi Kisuke. Everything in the world inside Shibata's head was complete, he would later say, and I couldn't get him to change one thing. There may have been a reason why Shibata's world was so complete and he was so against changing any part of it. It comes from the fact he quite literally dreamed it. Sometime before and during production of the project, Shibata began to dream of exploring a Japanese house full of ghosts from the first-person perspective while carrying a camera. The house, the ghosts, the weapons, all of it came from his detailed dreams, and Shibata was very determined to keep those central elements the same as his personal experiences. But there were things that had to be changed. His dreams were all from his own point of view, or first person, but the game couldn't be first person all the time. Instead, it had to be a balance of third and first person to keep the fear tense at all times. In third person, your view of what is ahead and behind is limited, and the fear that something might be about to attack the character on screen rises. You feel sympathy for the character, and you feel the loneliness of the image of a singular young girl in this nightmarish scenario. In the first person, you have to look at the nightmare head on, and by switching the two situations, you can't entirely become too used to or complacent with either of them. The story of their game would come from Shibata's concepts, starting with imagining what scenario would be frightening in a Japanese house, and what kind of events or ghosts would be the scariest. From the countless ideas they had, they trimmed down and cleaned up the best into a working concept. The central idea, the focus on a ritual gone wrong, would draw from Japanese folklore in a roundabout way. Shibata came up with it, but it wasn't from researching Japanese stories. It was from reading manga, specifically Morohoshi Daijiro's Yokai Hunter series. Nearly every creative in the horror field in Japan, particularly those who grew up in the 70s, mentions Morohoshi as an influence on their work. He's a seminal manga artist and storyteller, whose adaptations of Japanese folktales and myths into modern mystery and horror stories took hold of a generation of readers. One story, Visitor of Darkness, would become the starting point for Shibata's own narrative in Fatal Frame. Sometime later, Morohoshi himself would apparently recognize the similarity. While developing this story, the team came upon a realization about their time period. The story originally was set in the modern age until the team realized that setting it further back in time would reinforce the sense of fear. In the modern age, there are multiple ways to connect to the world: computers, telephones, pagers. By setting the game in the 80s, before the widespread usage of these things, they could make the player feel even more isolated and alone. More important than anything else would be the ghosts. They had to look, move, feel like something unnatural yet natural, real yet ethereal, not alive yet not really dead. To achieve this difficult balance, the team was instructed by the one team member who could claim to have seen ghosts, and who instructed them as to how to recreate the feeling of seeing them. In fact, when Kikuchi asked Shibata how they were going to imagine their ghosts, he enigmatically told him, "We'll create the ones I saw in my dream." The ghosts of Shibata's experiences in and out of dreamland were blurry, fuzzy things, distorted and faceless, with a very intense and unique aura he was determined to recreate. Those of you who have seen spirits will understand, Shibata would later say in an interview. There's something called the atmosphere where spirits seem to come out, and creating this atmosphere was one of the most difficult elements of the game. His ultimate goal in creating the ghosts was the hope that one day another believer might approach him and say his ghosts were a faithful recreation of what believers experienced while seeing the supernatural. This meant considering more than just the ghost itself and how it appeared, but how its appearance affected the environment around them. 3 key elements were focused on: lighting, movement, and silence. First, to recreate the density of the air during a ghost appearance, they used sounds that are impossible for humans to perceive, so that it seems like the scene is silent when it's not. Then there was the humidity, created by a careful balance of the amount of light and darkness, and the grain that would appear on screen, along with a carefully balanced movement speed for both the player and the spirits. They were able to create an environment that felt frightening and tense, even when the player was merely walking around. This careful balancing act was the work of Shibata, Hasegawa, Takasaki, and the game's sound team. Shibata worked alongside them, making small adjustments to the sounds, the visual grain, and the brightness of every scene, late into the project's development. Eventually, they created a set of 20 to 30 variations of effects out of 20 to 30,000 possibilities spread throughout the game. Once they had the atmosphere, they could consider the ghosts themselves, how they would look and how they would move. Being inanimate and dead, ghosts don't have to move like living things or animate objects. The team behind their movements and visual effects remained conscious of the inorganic element, combining the corpse-like stiffness with human emotions to create a terrifying blend of the living and dead. The team was constantly talking about the ghosts and how to depict them, tweaking and redoing them over and over. Once they felt they had it, they still struggled with slowdown and technical issues caused by the amount of visual effects being used, and had to start trimming it down. Grains and static, color loss, darkness and brightness, all of these were carefully blended to create a unique experience for each and every ghost. But while these ghosts were meant to be terrifying, there was also something alluring about them. After all, if they were too disgusting, the player could hardly empathize with them. These dead were lost souls, not evil villains or soulless corpses. They were people, and the team wanted the player to want to help these spirits. Toshiyuki would go so far as to hope the players wouldn't just be terrified. If you happen to find yourself with even the slightest respite from the approaching fear, please also take a look at their beauty. Another team member heavily involved in the ghost's presence was Iuchi Tsuyoshi. He was in charge of creating the ghost's combat system. An essential concern for him was the unique composition of their enemies. Monsters and zombies are inherently physical, but ghosts don't have bodies. How do you convey a sense of danger from something that's essentially made of wisps of air? Iuchi developed a system based on how the ghosts died. Considering what brought them to their death, what they might want that would keep them trapped here, and how those desires would be reflected in their body, their movements, their voice. By the end of the project, Iuchi says he could imagine in my head how each one had died. He carefully considered every element of their appearance and movement through the environment, differentiating how certain ghosts appeared, disappeared, moved, and attacked to keep things interesting. Each ghost had a personality, something that would leave an impression, which was Iuchi's goal, to have the player viscerally react to the ghost with the sensation it was disgusting or pitiful or awful. Broken Neck, one of the more infamous ghosts, can drop from above in a similar way to the manner of her death. Iuchi called this the catcher attack, referring to UFO catchers, similar to Western claw machines. Each of Iuchi's ghosts was meant to be more than one-dimensional, to have multiple patterns of movements and attacks. His ultimate hope for his ghosts was that during the game, players would listen to their words and use them to understand their dying wishes. They had a world to explore and ghosts to escape from, yet they still didn't have the pivotal point, a main character. Creating this central person was a struggle early on, one the team solved by using the silhouette of a character in the place of their playable character. For months into the project, they still didn't know who their heroine would be. It would be a woman, that much Shibata knew, but unlike the rest of the game experience, he hadn't felt who the woman would be. In his dreams, he saw the mansion and its ghosts in the first person. He couldn't see the person walking around. In his waking hours, he had a hard time figuring out just who would be the kind of person to go to a haunted mansion willingly. Eventually, Shibata created a design document describing the character's history, personality, and even some desired physical features, which he handed to Hasegawa Hitoshi as a guideline for their heroine. Hasegawa also had a hard time imagining who this character would be at first. Typically, he could use a weapon as a kind of a starting point. A swordsman has a traditional look versus a gunman. But this game was using a camera. There was no artistic tradition to follow, no reference to look to beyond Shibata's handwritten notes. Hasegawa approached the project with a desire to balance fear and realness. If the character looked too cartoonish or fake, it would be hard to empathize and feel her fear. But they had to look a little fantastical to keep from being boring and dull. According to the design document, she should be young, slender, and female. Because of Shibata's belief and the larger Shinto traditions it stemmed from, that associated youth and femininity with spiritual power. Women are believed to be more in tune with the spirit world due to the type of energy that both women and ghosts have, known better in the West as the yin of the yin-yang. Slenderness was thought to come from the stress and pain of seeing ghosts. You lose weight from the fright of it. A young, slender character would look like she had a strong sixth sense, in Shibata's words. She was made to look younger than her actual age, because the young are also considered closer to the spirit world. But she needed to have a shadow. She had trauma in her past. The design outline said she should have impressive eyes, big, wet black eyes to reflect her ephemeral sense, and she should have a strong core in her gaze since she's the protagonist. Her hair was to be long, down to her back, to show her spiritual power, another association with Shinto tradition. But because she hated her power, she would tie up her hair with a red hair tie. She would have an important hair ornament held up in an asymmetrical hairstyle. The hairstyle wouldn't work in the final product, as it just looked off when examined in the mirror in-game. But the hairpiece remained. It originally had story significance as a spiritual device handed down in the main character's family, but those details were cut for time. Another detail was her necklace, a black choker, which would have two purposes. Shibata wanted her to share an element of her design with her brother, a character who was already designed, and it foreshadowed a central element of the game's plot. The color scheme would become white, black, and red, with red acting as a highlight, hinting at the themes of blood in the game. In addition, these three colors are the colors of Shinto, giving them spiritual significance to a Japanese audience. Early character designs were entirely dark black, but it made their protagonists too difficult to see, so they went back to the drawing board. One of the original designs was an intricate Gothic outfit in a Taisho Roman style, during a time when the game was set further back in the past than it would eventually be. This version saw the protagonist dressed head to toe in indigo velvet, and a long skirt lined with lace and cords and inner layers of red velvet. A second, more modern option was designed, and it was this design that was tweaked to eventually become the look of Miku. Her name comes from her color, the red highlight that appears in her design. While he didn't know what she looked like, Shibata decided her name early on. However, the word isn't traditionally used as a name in Japan. It threw a lot of the team off, but Shibata stuck to his guns, and eventually the name Miku caught on. She would also have multiple unlockable costumes. The Ganguro outfit idea came from Hasagawa, the gothic Lolita was Shibata's idea, and the orange shirt costume was Kikuchi's. Once she was designed, she could finally exist in the game world, and her movements in the game would be the work of the motion designers, led by Shibata Kohei. Working alongside him was designer Shimizu Katsuyuki, who helped the team solve a very specific problem. The main character's motions are what the player sees most of all. If they look wrong or exaggerated, it won't be long before players recognize something is off. The team behind the motion focused on creating natural motions and redid them over and over again. They couldn't imagine their heroine running through the haunted mansion. That felt weird. But calm walking didn't exactly feel right either. It was once again a balancing game. It had to be set at a pace that would be scary without stressing the player out. For Shimizu, however, that wasn't the hardest part. It was the stairs. The house had multiple levels, and the player would be going up and down the stairs constantly. Normally, people use stairs without thinking about it. But Shimizu realized that when they made their own staircase movements, something was wrong. So he decided to use the stairs over and over, really concentrating on his movements. He watched how others used the steps at the train station, and over time, eventually developed a method of motion that felt natural. Another motion designer was Yoshizawa Yoshikatsu. His work focused on motions for the cutscenes of the game. He was particularly stressed about Miku's motions and expressions, since she was the central character, and her emotions were the heart of the CG scenes. It was his job to animate her facial expressions, and he worried constantly about how to express her emotions to the player. It was Yoshizawa's first pure horror game. He'd worked on Deception 2 and 3 beforehand, and he wasn't sure how to make characters look properly afraid, how to make them look as if they're truly suffering. He was constantly aware of that demand, and the fact that if the character didn't look afraid, there was no reason for the player to feel afraid either. There was also the fear that too much fear could become comical and over-exaggerated. During development, Yoshizawa would sometimes review a scene he'd just finished, only to end up laughing at it. He instructed his fellow designers to focus on making it look natural, that the characters moved like humans, especially in the movements of their eyes. He worked on the ghost's motions as well, and was heavily involved in all the cutscenes start to finish. These cutscenes were apparently well-liked within the company and highly praised. But if there was a slight critique or negative opinion, Yoshizawa would discuss each one with the director and cutscene team, and he redid them over and over again. And of course, there was the game's sound. A world of nightmarish noise and silence which would be developed by a team of 4, credited as Not M, Okuda, Saito, and Toyota Ayako. Okuda refers to Okuda Shigekiyo, a composer and musician who'd been working on Tecmo games since 1994. Saito refers to Atsuo Saito, who likely joined the team late in 2001. The PS2 had new capabilities the team planned to put to use, specifically stereophonic sound, or multi-directional sound, which recreates the sensation of sounds coming from in front, to the side, or behind you. This would allow the team to have noises and effects which seem to come from different directions, making the game not only seem more realistic, but more terrifying. After testing multiple third-party tools for their games, the team settled on Arnis Sound Technologies, due to its ability to make the sound on both sides seem like it was moving in 3D. The high quality of the sound effects and this stereophonic sound combined to make the listener truly feel as if they were there, hearing someone move or something breathing just behind them. Shibata worked closely with the sound team, giving feedback and requesting additional sounds throughout the project. He would later recall a time the man in charge of the sound, possibly Saito, turned to look behind him while he was playing the game himself. "I'll never forget his face of, 'Damn it,' Shibata said. 'I fell into the trap I set myself.'" The director gave very specific directions on the sound, especially relating to the timing. A lot of the sounds they sampled were from foreign CDs, foreign sound effects rather than Japanese, to create a more alien feeling. The team found that sounds without meaning were often the most frightening, and were careful to spread out effects that were unrelated and even distant from the player, implying that things were moving even outside their view. These sounds were added close to the end of development. The voices of the ghosts were actually recorded by Shibata himself. He did his best to instruct the team as to how the ghosts and their atmosphere should sound, drawing on his personal experiences, but he had a hard time getting them to understand. He'd tell them things like, "Remember the saddest thing that's ever happened to you," or "Feel bitter about everything in the world," as a guideline, creating sound. Eventually, the team recorded Shibata imitating the voices of spirits he heard as a child, and that imitation was used in the game. But what were they going to call the game? Kikuchi Kisuke's original title was Reikoku, a word that means ruthless or cold-hearted in Japanese, but another game released using that title before they could use it. Kikuchi went back to the drawing board, considering over 200 options from multiple languages, including Japanese, English, German, and French, and eventually he came back to their original project's working title, 0. 0 is a number which represents something that doesn't exist. It represents nothingness. Ghosts, too, are something made of nothing, and so the two were somatically matched in Kikuchi's mind. The symbol for 0 and the symbol for ghosts can both be read as rei in Japanese, creating a powerful association between the two concepts. It was the perfect match. According to Kikuchi, the toughest part of developing the game was the third stage. Describing the order of events himself, he says they began with the pace of the game, and then created the story, and from that, story cutscenes, which they disassembled and used for promotional videos. At that time, everything was still entirely in black and white. Then they created the areas of the game, which came across as very realistic, while the characters still had something of an anime touch to them. They kept readjusting the ghosts so it wouldn't feel like a puppet show overtopped the scenery, and they kept making these adjustments up to release. Purposefully adding noise to obscure the picture, so you can only see the areas where your light hits the shadows. We made it so that things would be left to the players' imaginations, Shibata would later say, a technique he then called the aesthetics of subtraction. At this time, the first cutscene the team made was shown publicly to the company at a briefing. Everyone watching was taken aback, and Kikuchi was really anxious about it. Was what they were making really okay to make, in a social or moral sense? Soon after, the game debuted in a number of magazines, where responses were mixed between Resident Evil ripoff and looks interesting. Then it debuted at the Tokyo Game Show in 2001, and that was when it took off. Players loved it. Up until that point, upper management had still worried about this project, often asking, "Is this okay?" in Kikuchi's own words. But after the show, management completely pivoted. Kikuchi remembers a member of management saying to him, while watching the crowds playing the game at the show, "Did you see the way the players' eyes sparkled?" There was a lot, however, that did not make it into the final game. When it came to asking if something was okay to do, there was plenty the team ended up feeling went too far or was too much. It began with the very first scene. Originally a much longer, detailed introduction involving a car drive that included Mafuyu at the wheel and Miku in the passenger seat. This version saw Miku falling asleep in the car, dreaming of the mansion and the girl in the white kimono, only to awaken to find her brother missing, and the same mansion outside the car waiting for her. There was also the first introduction of Ghost to Miku, a scene which originally dragged on and on, involving multiple sudden jumps and the character spinning around to see nothing behind her. Both these scenes were eventually cut down for being too long. Dragging on so long, the buildup of fear was thrown out of whack. They felt it made the game feel too top-heavy. There were other scenes cut for the amount of violence they included. The blind demon ritual originally went on longer, showing blood seeping from her eyes alongside terribly strange sounds that made the listener feel very unpleasant. Then there was the strangling ritual, which in the game ends with the woman tied to poles. Originally, it showed far more of that particularly nasty scene. You would hear the maiden scream as she was stretched. hear the sound of tearing and 4 limbs flopping onto the floor. The original idea behind the strangling ritual came from the team's concept of, what was the scariest way to die, a death people would least like to suffer? The strangling ritual was the answer, but just including such a violent thing as a concept felt like going too far for Kikuchi at first. He wasn't sure it would be allowed, but he agreed, and the team went ahead with the idea as the central ritual of the game. Actually showing it, however, was a step too far for him. The family leader who lost his mind and killed everyone in the mansion was originally going to carry a furoshiki, a cloth bundle. The bundle would drip blood, and inside would be a human head. A flashback would have shown a young girl watching as the family had murdered 4 men, and a flash of lightning would reveal the decapitated heads lined up along a wall. The last part was particularly popular with the team, so while it was decided to cut it from the game, the team made a computer wallpaper out of the image. A portion of gameplay that involved finding the severed heads was also cut. Originally, the entire game was 5 chapters, but Kikuchi felt it was too long, so they cut it down. In response, some content was pushed into Chapter 2, making it the longest portion of the game. Another cut at Kikuchi's request was a pool of blood meant to appear at the site of the family head's suicide, a scene that was going to be shown, but was also cut. An incredible amount of gore and violence was removed, often at Kikuchi's behest, and sometimes because the team themselves realized they really had gone too far. Kikuchi would comment that the most brutal, intense scenes tended to be the scenes the team put the most heart and effort into, only to realize in retrospect what they'd made was too much, and they couldn't keep it as is, trimming bits, changing the angles of the scene, or ultimately cutting entire portions. In an interview, Kikuchi and Shibata would banter about these intense scenes, with Shibata saying Kikuchi told him to not make such brutal scenes, but that Shibata himself felt such things would be okay. In response, Kikuchi said, "Of course something like that wouldn't be." Shibata replied, "But I liked them. Okay, I guess we can just sell it online." No way! Another element that was cut, however, came from a singular member of the team. In the Moon Shrine area, the remains of the previous Rope Shrine Maiden is mummified, and is visible to the player later in the game. Originally, the team wanted to have all the past maidens enshrined in the hallway. However, the female member of staff who was designing this particular area, likely either Ijima Rie or Ugami Sachiko, both women working on the stage modeling team, hated mummies. After having survived modeling one mummy, the woman saw the design document detailing an entire row of them, and she angrily decreed, "I'm not making any more mummies." So the idea was dropped. It was in fact very common for the Project Zero team to be frightened. Besides Shibata, no one on the team was really a horror fan, and none of them were exactly fans of ghosts. Traditionally, projects in Japan that involve references to the supernatural will receive ritual purification from priests as a way of placating local spirits. Shibata decided against doing this for Project Zero. He felt it was a lost opportunity if they were to send ghosts away. His team, however, felt differently. He was asked for a purification at least once a week, and some team members started wearing ofuda, or protection charms against spirits while they were at work. And of course, there were stories of supernatural occurrences at the office, for Shibata and for members of his team. A team member that Shibata refers to as S, the man in charge of sound, likely Atsuo Saito, said to him that every time they played Fatal Frame at home, their pet bird would go mad in their cage. Another sound team member was playing the game with a friend when the two suddenly heard a snapping sound. The cup of tea they'd had sitting on the table had snapped clean in half, right down the middle. The team gave a copy of the game to a journalist, who took it home and set it on a shelf, going to bed for the night. That same shelf shook constantly through the night, waking the man, and in the morning the journalist returned to the game without ever playing it or writing an article. Some of these tales would become infamous among Tecmo staff, especially when they were shared on the company website. A new hire to the company would later ask Shibata whether all these tales were true, and Shibata said they were. Kikuchi would tell him not to scare the newbies, to which Shibata would reply it wasn't his fault that creepy things happened. A fluorescent light in the office shattered out of nowhere. A faucet was left running in the bathroom, soaking the floors down as far as the first basement. In that same bathroom, a mirror broke into tiny pieces, creating a huge crash that drew everyone, including the director, towards the men's bathroom. No one was in the room. Shibata took a picture of the event as evidence, but when he tried to share it during an interview, Kikuchi asked the interviewer to remove it from the article. During the interview, Shibata would say he'd seen a long-haired woman reflected in the broken mirror. "For real?" Kikuchi replied. Shibata said, "I wish it was." And Kikuchi, "Stop that! That's not funny!" Weird things happened inside the game world as well. The CG team had trouble with the rope hallway scene, a flashback that shows the writer's team arriving at the mansion. In the finished cutscene, a pair of feet floating in the air would appear, where there wasn't supposed to be any data. The team tried multiple times to remove it to no success. Nothing was in the data, and eventually it just disappeared. Shibata thought it was just an error in the tools, but it happened to mirror something he was writing for the game at the time, which was creepy. For years, Shibata had gone without any more supernatural events occurring in his life, but after he began developing Fatal Frame, the ghosts of his youth began to return. Long, glossy black hair began appearing in his house, his clothes, his bag, even on his keyboard at work. Hair that was far too long to be his own. When asked about it, Kikuchi teased Shibata, asking if he didn't honestly know where or who it could have come from. Eventually, Shibata felt if there was a ghost in his house, he'd rather it come out. And if it was going to show, he would prefer if it were a pretty ghost. As a child, the ghosts he saw were grotesque or faceless. The pretty feminine hair made him hope for a better outcome this time around. He never did see this female ghost during the first game, which Shibata was at the time disappointed about. Other stories around the office include a rather frightening tale of something that happened to Planner T, a female team member, likely Toyota Masaki. Working late into the night, she was suddenly pulled by her hair towards the ceiling and screamed. Another, Planner H, possibly Hasagawa, saw a woman reflected in glass on his way home from work, only to turn and realize he was alone. The last, most miraculous story, the only one Shibata felt couldn't be explained away, happened to the director while he was working alone. The other staff was off taking naps. Many of them were spending full days at the office. He felt lonely by himself. Looking up from his desk, Shibata realized the meeting room door was open. And from out of the door, he saw a white face appear, mouth open, slack, with pale hair. The face ducked back into the room, and then peeked out. Ducked in, peeked out, over and over again. The silliness of it broke Shibata out of his shock, and he laughed, and decided to focus back on his work. The face remained with him for another hour that night. Finally, he stood to investigate, and the face vanished. In the end, though, Shibata found the event was, while seemingly impossible, far too humorous to call it a ghost. I suppose the real-life ghostly encounters are the kind that end abruptly, without the climax or punchline you might find in a ghost story. Before the game's release, Tecmo would arrange a rather unique experience for games journalists. So unique, in fact, one attendee at the event wrote a detailed write-up of his experiences, one Akira Mark Fujita, a writer at the time for IGN. He and his fellow journalists were taken via limo to the Brookdale Lodge near Santa Cruz, California, a famous haunted locale and their home for the next night. The event included multiple sessions of ghost storytelling and history on their haunted home, even watching an episode of Ripley's Believe It or Not that featured the building. There was a Ouija board session, in which a spirit said it was 28Q years old, and a scavenger hunt throughout the many spooky buildings. Tecmo reps attended and led the event, at times adding to the atmosphere by whispering instructions to their guests. But as much as fear was the focus, there was a lot of laughter as well, sometimes at the expense of the spooked. Once they found all the clues and solved the scavenger hunt, they would find a room with Fatal Frame waiting for them, having been primed with real scares before their scary game experience. The journalist who would play the game the longest would receive a prize in the morning, which turned out to be an instant camera. The story ended with the limo ride home and one of the journalists, John Gibson, getting sick and throwing up out the car window. Another article in a magazine from the time reads, "I apologize, Zoe Flower. I hope my cookies didn't spill on your coat. That's just one misadventure. A 24-hour period of jet lag, traditional Irish fish and chips, spooky folk tales, queasiness, and a sleepless night of gameplay." The game would release in Japan in 2001, with no plans to go global at first. But it wasn't long before the company was receiving offers from outside sources asking to publish the game. It would make its way to North America the next year as Fatal Frame. It would take longer to reach Europe, however, as Tecmo didn't have any publishing infrastructure there at the time. Instead, the French publisher Wanadoo Editions bought the rights to it, to major success. The Ring had just released in France around this time, and the game, known as Project Zero in Europe, apparently did some of its best sales there. In North America, the game would release with a rather unique selling point, a description reading, "based on a true story." A press release written for the game would go further, with quotes from Shibata Makoto referring to a mansion outside Tokyo, which was the inspiration for the game's locale, a terrible series of murders that had happened there, as well as a story about a woman's death in a haunted tree. For years, this real Himuro mansion was the rumored source of the true story, with images of said mansion floating around online, seemingly originating in a 2002 IGN article. The stories that Shibata references seem to be based on general Japanese folklore, as traced by Lucia at The Ghost in My Machine. On the Japanese side, a writer and local Tokyo citizen discussed the rumors, writing they'd never heard of such a place as Himuro Mansion, not to mention a mansion outside of Tokyo where murders occurred. In Japan and elsewhere, the true story angle didn't appear anywhere in marketing, only North America, possibly due to the popularity of Blair Witch and its purported real-world legend. It's likely the advertising department thought to play into that with Fatal Frame, coming up with the true story angle with little to no input from the original team. Project Zero's team had set out to create the most frightening game they could, and they'd succeeded. They'd been told multiple stories of players who'd been unable to finish the game, who'd only progressed about halfway through. It was frightening, and it was quickly shaping up to be a staple of the genre. But it was also a learning curve. It was experimental, and even during development, what the team was doing was so different. They themselves were having to figure it out and change it constantly, altering it down to the last detail. Fatal Frame was the rough draft of a concept they would later come to perfect. Sales at home would see the game debuting at 15th on the Famitsu charts, selling 21,770 units its first week, before falling off the chart. Globally, however, the game would sell 700,000 units in North America, 600,000 units in Europe, with a further 200,000 from the world, leading to over 1 million overall. A decent amount of those sales were in South Korea, where the game would receive the Big Hit label for popular, well-selling games. An article was even published in the New York Times on June 27, 2002, reading, "It was the little things that made Frame so scary. The creak of the floorboards, a flashlight throwing spooky shadows against the wall, the mysterious ropes hanging from the ceiling, pages torn from diaries that describe disturbing rituals and strange disappearances." They'd had no plans for a sequel or a series. They hadn't even been sure the game would work. Kikuchi was afraid it would end up a cult game that made a small splash and vanished. To their surprise, the game was a hit, especially outside Japan, even receiving an offer from DreamWorks to make a movie adaptation as early as the first game. It wouldn't be made, but the idea went far enough. Kikuchi was meeting with producers in America to discuss a Fatal Frame-themed film. What was their next step? They'd built their world and designed their idea of fear, a fear so terrible, many found the game unplayable. Now they had to refine that fear and create an experience that could both frighten and entice the player, right until the very end. The major success of their first game, not just at home, but across the world, made the team certain they could turn this one-off game into a series. It wouldn't be a traditional series. Kikuchi Kisuke wasn't really a fan of genuine sequels, but it would be a continuation of the style, substance, and themes of the first game, streamlined and perfected. The connecting thread between the two stories would be one object: the camera. Reactions to the first game were incredibly varied. Some were so scared they couldn't finish it, while others were scared but still wanted even greater scares. Many found it incredibly difficult to play, and just as many found it far too easy. It was a wild variety of responses, and it would require nuanced consideration to balance fear and interest, difficulty and entertainment. Horror was still the focus, but action would also receive a tune-up. Shibata Makoto vividly remembers at least one person who told him the first game was too scary, and to make the next one scarier. Kikuchi himself felt driven to push the horror further. He wanted to provide a type of horror unique to games that will not be outdone by horror movies or novels. He planned to achieve it by using situation and presentation, not grotesque imagery. He was glad the first game was so popular, but felt it contained mistakes that hindered it, things he felt they could alter in order to create a game that might be considered a standard of the horror genre. But how to create fear that wasn't overwhelming? The same way you boil a frog. The team decided to use a compelling story and a slow, steady intro to lure players into being enticed by the game, too invested in the story to give up by the time the spooks and scares became more intense. The first game opened right in the action with very little build-up. This time, they would show the characters entering into the nightmare. Development began not long after the first game's release, and was once again drawn from the realm of Shibata Makoto's dreams. It was a vision of a pair of twins, who were scary but also beautiful, a theme that would become the lifeblood of Fatal Frame 2. Of course, they were also building off what they'd originally made, and continuing to perfect their old techniques, including Shibata's theory of the fear of subtraction. In his own words, "Eventually we thought about what the scariest thing was, and wondered if it was what people imagine. Whatever kind of CG we showed off, what people imagine would be scariest. Rather than seeing the whole thing, just seeing a little, or thinking you'd seen something but hadn't. Those parts are the scariest." The first game's development had focused on the world and its ghosts. They had to solve the riddle of how to convey the experience of being haunted, and the story came second. This time, they had their world built and their systems in place, and the focus would be on a compelling story to draw the player into the nightmare. In the words of Hasegawa and Kikuchi, it would be horror that appeals to the human imagination. To begin, they divided their team into 3 parts. A core team would work on the early development of Fatal Frame 2's concept. Another would be working on Tecmo's Gallop Racer project. And a third would be working on creating the Xbox port of the first Fatal Frame. While those 2 peripheral projects were ongoing, the central Fatal Frame 2 people would be writing the story and setting of the next game. And once the other projects were done, the 3 parts would coalesce and bring Fatal Frame 2 to life. The central Fatal Frame 2 conceptual team likely included Shibata Makoto as director and scenario writer, as well as Nishimura Akira, a new member of the team who would work on visual art design, likely referring to concept art. Others may have included Yamaguchi Kazuhiro, a game planner, Yazaki Hiroyuki, a ghost concept designer, and Iuchi Tsuyoshi, a game planner who also worked on scenario writing. These team members are not in the credits of either the Xbox port or Gallop Racer, and their roles would make sense as part of a concept design team. It would be this team that developed the story, the lore, and the setting of Fatal Frame 2. Shibata felt the first game was cold and lonely, with little setup to connect you to the characters or their feelings. This time, the slow intro would allow the player to better identify with their protagonist, and the addition of a sister and a story themed around family would add some warmth and tragedy to the game. The theme was symmetry, specifically the sadness that results when two things that must be together in order to be a complete whole are pulled apart, such as a pair of twins or the wings of a butterfly. When symmetry breaks down, tragedy is the result, and further tragedy comes from the entity's need to be whole again. Loneliness was the major focus of Fear this time. You start with your sister, but quickly lose her, and every time you're reunited, she's lost again, reinforcing the terror and sadness of being alone. In Shibata's words, loneliness conveys a fearful memory from childhood, the feeling of, it doesn't matter who, I want to tell someone how scared I am right away. Unfortunately, an element of this twin-themed horror would be lost in translation outside of Japan. In the Japanese version, the sisters refer to each other with Japanese terms. Mio calls Mayu Oni-chan, meaning literally big sister. This sets up an expectation for the audience tied into the game's ritual theme of big and little sisters playing specific roles, which leads to a surprise revelation late in the game. In other languages lacking a similar term, they wouldn't have had the same build-up or surprise. In English, Mio simply calls Mayu by her name. When Kikuchi Kisuke read the story document the first time, he was moved to tears. He realized that the axis for their story was symmetrical horror, and that symmetry was built into the gameplay, the world, the characters, and the environment. The first game was most heavily inspired by The Ring and the works of manga artist Morohoshi Daijiro. Two new influences were used for Fatal Frame 2, likely from Kikuchi's influence, as he names these works as personal favorites of his, the works of novelist Yokomizo Seishi and the movie adaptation of The Shining. Yokomizo is a well-known mystery novelist in Japan, known best for his historical detective fiction. One of his most famous works, The Honjin Murders, is a locked room mystery that takes place in an isolated mansion surrounded by snow. His work was well known for its Japanese aesthetic and depictions of nature, its explorations of Japanese traditions and customs, and at times the violent nature of them. The Shining, an American film adaptation of the Stephen King novel, is the story of a man in an isolated mansion slowly driven to madness by the sight, real or imagined, of strange things in the house. Both of these works are heavily stylized horror-themed works that focus on isolation and violence. Kikuchi particularly notes that he learned unique atmosphere and feelings like an air from both Yokomizo and The Shining. In creating the world, they were once again building a compelling and beautiful setting, and then hiding it away in shadow. Kikuchi remarked how inefficient this was, to spend so much time building a stylized, detailed setting the player wouldn't see, but this meticulous style of creation was incredibly important. Shibata felt his team spent more time considering and building each and every room of their Fatal Frame games, putting thought and meaning into each piece of furniture and every sliding door than perhaps any game team had before. They didn't just want to scare players, they wanted to create something beautiful, and this fear and beauty theme was heavily impressed upon the CG team for Fatal Frame 2. Inari Daisuke remembers being asked to create movies that were scary and beautiful, in the sense of the ethereal beauty of Japan in the midst of horror, a task he found daunting and difficult. The CG team was given films and art books to draw from by the director, which helped them create the aesthetic of Japanese horror and beauty Shibata was looking for. Lighting was once again a major focus, and one of Hasegawa Hitoshi's major concerns. They often placed illumination in places that wouldn't be physically possible in the real world, something unrealistic and yet the best option aesthetically. Contrast is the key to fear, in Hasegawa's opinion. The balance between light and dark is what leads to fear, but the challenge is to make an unnatural shadow look natural. It wasn't enough to make it dark, as he'd learned in the previous game. One room in particular that was incredibly hard was the final boss arena where the player fights the Kusabi. Placing the candles in that room in a way that looked right was extremely difficult. A heavy focus was placed on the screen effects and spotlighting of Fatal Frame 2. They were further perfecting their atmosphere and ghostly auras. This time, they applied fog to every screen to add a sense of depth, and used dither and contrast in pixel-by-pixel increments to convey the unpleasant feeling of the scene. To break this down, dither is a technique in audio production in which a small amount of random noise is added to the audio to distort the sound. Contrast refers to the visual aspect of editing the brightness and darkness, meaning that the team was considering the lighting and sound effects of the game on a pixel-by-pixel basis, literally tiny increments of change across the entire game. The greatest challenge would once again be the combat. It was an impossible scenario, too hard for some, too easy for others. Finding a balance that reinforced the horror without being too horrifying, that created a challenge that wasn't too challenging, almost sounded impossible, the Project Zero team was willing to try. They had members of the team constantly playtest the game themselves and kept track of each person's personal experience. Horror is subjective, and what scares one person may not scare another, so they had case studies of dozens of players from the team, using trial and error to evaluate what worked and what didn't in most cases. This way, they could tweak fights that were too hard or not hard enough, measuring against a larger swath of people and styles of play. Ultimately, they decided to add an equipment system to give action-oriented fans more tools to experiment with, while still focusing primarily on the horror experience. After the release of the first game, many fans spoke to Shibata about their experience with it, and some of them were fellow believers and experiencers of ghostly phenomena. It was exactly what he dreamed, that others who saw ghosts would see in his game a recognizable experience of being haunted. One person, however, had a very unique opinion about it. It was during an interview with an older male interviewer, who stopped in the midst of his questions to comment that he too could see ghosts, and that he felt the ghosts in the game were similar to his experience, yet he'd always experienced them as rather slow creatures. Somewhat angrily, he demanded of Shibata, "Why'd you have to make them so fast?" For this singular individual, Shibata reevaluated the speed of his enemies. In the previous game, the ghosts would duck and dodge out of sight of the viewfinder to make it harder to defeat them, since to accumulate power you had to focus the shot on the ghost for a long time. This time, they altered the combat to focus on both proximity and movement. You could power up based on how close you were and how well you tracked the ghost's movements. So instead of constantly jumping out of frame, the ghosts moved around the room, but not incredibly quickly or instantaneously. "I hope that made him happy," Shibata said. The movements of the ghosts were a major focus of 2's revamped Fatal Frame, not just in combat, but in general. The team spent careful consideration on how spirits behaved, how they randomly appeared and disappeared, and tried to reinforce a feeling that they were present even after they'd been defeated. Shibata called this scenario the never-ending loop, characteristic of certain horror stories in which the player feels trapped in a cycle that never ends. The sound team for Fatal Frame 2 was now a trio, consisting of Okuda, Saito, and Toyota, 3 of the 4 who worked on the previous game. Their main focus for their work was the idea that the player was there, putting them into the very house they were walking in, creating the sensation they were present in the game. Shibata went to an old Japanese house and recorded sounds there, walking across tatami mats, opening sliding doors. During playtesting, they would often comment that parts of the game just weren't scary yet, so they kept experimenting and adding to the experience until just walking around the house was itself a nightmare. They added to the frightening effect by making sounds never experienced in your daily life. The player would be taken aback by noise that wasn't realistic or natural, and thus extra frightening. A new feature would be added to this game, one that Kikuchi had previously thought of but not implemented: a theme song. He felt the human voice had power. If the song remains in the ears of those who hear it, it will make a strong impression to those who play the game. So he decided the sequel would have a theme song, a voice-powered song that would make people turn around to listen the moment they heard it. Kikuchi asked Shibata to figure out who they should ask to perform the song. Shibata agreed. He was interested in finding something special and unique that could express the world of their game. It had to resonate with the story, even if the words weren't an exact match for the events in-game. With that in mind, he headed to a CD store in Shinjuku in late summer. Going through the CDs alphabetically, he found his first pick at the top: Amano Suki, formerly known as Amano Tsukiko. It was her debut single, Hakoniwa, first released that June, and listening to it, the song immediately convinced Shibata that Amano was the one to write Fatal Frame. He told Kikuchi as much, but the man wasn't convinced. They still went through considering other artists, but ultimately Kikuchi was pulled around to Shibata's way of thinking. The music had a Japanese atmosphere in Shibata's words. At the end of Hakoniwa, he heard a voice, like a character repeatedly speaking, which scared him. He kept listening and realized the words were coming from deep within his heart, as if a ghost were speaking with him. That's how he knew Amano was the one. The world of her music and the world of Fatal Frame were on the same wavelength. They received approval from the musician's side and got to work by sending her plenty of material on the game, including a plot summary and concept art. The work was about halfway finished when she received the draft. The idea of fear and beauty was conveyed to her, though Amano felt it was far more frightening than it was beautiful. Amano had been interested in music since she was very young, and started taking piano lessons when she was 5. She was just starting out in her professional career when she wrote for Fatal Frame, and eventually would become an established artist, well known for writing her own songs, composing her own video performances, and making her own detailed costumes. Once she was on board, the first thing Amano did was seek out and play the first game, and did so exactly as the game recommended, in the dark, with her headphones on. She thought she might be less afraid if she knew what she was doing, so she even took the time to go out and buy the strategy guide. Once she felt she had an understanding of Fatal Frame, she took a look at the multitudes of notes Shibata had sent her, called Requests from Shibata. Almost 10 sheets of manuscript paper, followed by plenty of concept art over time. Kikuchi started calling the correspondence between Shibata and Amano their love letters. When it came to writing a song for Fatal Frame 2, it started with a singular image. When she heard the game's title, Akai Cho in Japanese, meaning red butterfly, she thought of hands. The palm is the part of the human body that can be made to look like a butterfly. She had the image of 2 overlapping hands, one of them disappearing. Once she read all the game notes, she realized she had the right idea. The theme song for the game would be Cho, which is Japanese for butterfly. Shibata said he was so happy when he heard the final song, he felt he could have died from happiness. Ever the producer, Kikuchi told him he could die when the game was finished. Like the first game, there was plenty that was cut from Fatal Frame 2 for being too intense, too much, or far too grotesque. The Mourner ghosts were going to have their throats crushed, but that was considered too gross. Their eyes are sewn shut, but a scene that showed their eyes being sewn shut was not approved. Kikuchi was once again behind the cut. Showing the grotesque too much didn't build fear in his mind. It was far worse to see the sewn-shut eyes and wonder what happened. In a similar manner, the scene of the massacre was removed from the game. Instead of showing the killing, a far more disturbing image of a young girl laughing among corpses conveyed a worse sense of dread. The goal wasn't to avoid fear, but to avoid the grotesque, in Kikuchi's words, and the movie team in particular had to play a careful balancing game between too much and not enough. The opening to the game was intended to be a long, slow introduction to the world and its ghosts, meant to entice players into the game, but originally it started far more violently. One version included an overlapping memory of Sae being chased, so that it appeared as if ghostly villagers were chasing Mayu and Mio into the village. Another involved a rope ladder that broke, wrapping around Mayu's neck, almost choking her, which was a hint at the ending. Smaller changes also involved the main characters. Originally, the girls' names were Mio and Mai instead of Mayu. A backstory about the girls' hometown being destroyed to build a dam, which led them to enter the woods to make memories, was also cut for time. The information instead appeared in the game's manual. Originally, only Mayu, the sister NPC, had the sixth sense. For the player to be able to experience ghosts or memories of the past, they would have to stay with her. But the team quickly realized this was a buffer. The player felt safer with a buddy, and without her the main character was quite useless. Instead, Mio would also be able to see ghosts, and the story would be focused on separating the two girls. A holdover from the original concept can be seen in the first chapter, where Mio grabs Mayu's hand and sees a sudden flashback. Other changes related to story elements, like the doll in Chapter 7. Originally, that chapter was called The Underground Passageway, and the narrative was focused on uncovering its secret. But as they wrote the story, the side quest involving a haunted doll kept growing. The team liked the doll's story, and it took over more of the chapter until the narrative was reworked to focus on the house and the haunted doll, since it was considered the scarier narrative. In fact, Chapter 7 and the character of Chitose were favorites of the team, to the point that one team member created a special wallpaper of the ghostly character. The ending was also greatly altered. Originally, there were chapters 9 and 10, which later were fused into a singular final chapter. Walking down the hallway to the final confrontation was originally not hard at all. The ghosts wouldn't fight you, since they wanted the ritual to be completed. But Shibata realized this felt really anticlimactic, even if it made sense within the world building, so they had to create a scenario in which there was a climactic battle in the hall leading to the final event. The final boss, the Kusabi, was going to have a greater presence in the game originally. In Chapter 5, he was meant to chase you throughout the level, but they decided to change the focus of the chapter and kept him for the end. Eventually, this character, the terrifying, haunting remains of an ancient curse, earned an adorable nickname from Japanese fans. People started calling him Oba-san, which means grandma. Apparently, the long gray hair had players thinking it was an old woman, and the nickname stuck. The game also had a lot of costumes, many more than before, and many more were created than were ultimately used. Part of this, Kikuchi thinks, was the influence of a man who became involved in the technical side of the game, Itagaki Tomonobu, former head of Team Ninja, and a game designer most famous for Dead or Alive and Ninja Gaiden. Dead or Alive, in particular, is famous for its many varied and, spicy costumes. During Fatal Frame 2, Itagaki and his team assisted with some programming challenges, which led to Team Ninja and Team Project Zero becoming somewhat close. Some of the costumes were ultimately cut for being too risque. The Gothic Lolita, however, remained because it was designed by a woman, and Shibata felt that was a sign it was okay. There were also many styles of yukatas, traditional Japanese clothing, designed in two styles the team called chic and cute. The male team members tended to prefer the chic, while the female preferred the cute. Few of each type made it into the game. Fatal Frame 2 would receive a great deal of promotion, including another spectacularly haunting event at the Hakone Garden in Saratoga, California, sometime in the summer of 2003. It was more Japanese than Japan, in Kikuchi's words. He was the only team member to attend the event, and he recognized why the location was picked by the Americans. Once night fell, and the team started watching promotional material draped over a bamboo grove, it was very spooky and very Fatal Frame. There was also a psychic who spoke about the game, but since he didn't know English, Kikuchi could only recognize the words Fatal Frame, Butterfly, and Scary. After the promo video, the attending journalists were divided into pairs, tied together with a red ribbon on their wrists and each given a flashlight and a camera. Then they entered the woods at the base of the nearby mountains for a riddle-themed scavenger hunt that required them to take photographs of certain things, to conserve their film and even find more film out in the woods. Once the hunt was completed, the journalists found their way to the Queen Anne Hotel, a haunted hotel in San Francisco, where copies of the game were available. Most of the journalists felt the game wasn't too frightening after seeing the promo video, but after playing it, they were terrified. One journalist was so taken aback by a specific scene, they jumped up from their chair and shouted in surprise, then commented, "What a crazy game your team made. I'm thrilled." The event was talked about on cable television. It was covered in countless publications, and the game was picked as GamePro's Game of the Week after the event. Magazines in Italy and Taiwan had the game on their cover, and the title was clearly gaining momentum across the world. The game officially debuted at the Tokyo Game Show in September of 2003, and it was overwhelmed. The team hadn't expected so many people to be interested, but they were. Lines to play the game were out the door the entire event, swarming around the 8 closed rooms in which players could experience the game in complete darkness with headphones on. You also received a Fatal Frame 2 themed calendar. The game released in November of 2003 in Japan and Hong Kong, and in December in the United States. 2004 would see the game release in South Korea, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Australia, where it received 2 printings. In Japan, it sold 42,000 units in its first week, and another 9,000 units the next week. Within a year, it received the Best Of label, indicating best-selling PS2 games in Japan, and was reprinted in August of 2004 and again in 2007. In South Korea, it received a big hit reprint, indicating similar best-selling status. It's likely the game did its best sales in Japan, South Korea, and surprisingly, Australia. This game was beloved. East and West reviewers and journalists loved it. It was constantly ranked as one of the most frightening games of all time, even years after it was first released. GameWatch called it a game that touches the heartstrings and incites fear, yet felt it had a disappointing ending, a theme that would run throughout much of the initial fan reaction to the game. The butterfly ending was incredibly controversial, and a subject for debate for years among the Japanese fan base. It was controversial because it was powerful and emotional. Kikuchi felt it tied into the theme of inescapable destinies. Shibata felt the ending was fully earned. In fact, he'd wanted to drop more hints about Mayu's fate, but ultimately cut many of them. Still, he felt that you should have the vague feeling of what was really going on, a sense of feeling what was deep inside Mayu's heart by the time you reached the end. It's a game in which, by thinking backwards, the player realizes the deeper parts. In other words, the full picture comes together after having seen the end. Throughout the development of the first and second games, Shibata was known to go around and ask people if they'd experienced anything. He was always rather disappointed if they said no, and incredibly excited when they said yes. And Fatal Frame 2 also had a few strange events during development. There was a quiet voice of a girl crying Oni-chan superimposed over a line of dialogue. Unable to delete it, the line was left in, a quiet echo that's difficult to hear. In one of the radio files, there was a very strange moan the teen hadn't recorded. Shibata had been delighted when he first heard it, only to be told by the sound guy that he hadn't created it. In fact, he'd been trying to delete it all night. but it wouldn't go away, and the man was terrified. But the most intriguing and most infamous event happened to Shibata himself, and this time it happened at home. During the previous game, he began finding long black hair everywhere, but he never saw a ghost related to the hair. This time, a strange female presence would take up residence in his home. Late at night, a white hand would attempt to choke him. He would leap out of bed to find a slumped, blurred female figure with long black hair lying in his bed. He was actually shocked and somewhat annoyed at the time, asking what in the world she was, only for her to disappear. Lights turned on and off. The television worked strangely. All kinds of things happened, but only when Shibata slept at home. Eventually it became a nuisance because he had trouble sleeping, so he turned to the unthinkable. He was going to try and exorcise his ghost. He tried salt and various other internet remedies, but nothing worked. Complaining about it at the office, a female coworker overheard him and joked, saying he should try anti-odor spray. Being desperate, he decided to give it a shot. He went home and Febrezed his room. Over time, he recognized that when he used Febreze, the ghost didn't appear. He wondered if perhaps he'd made an important discovery, so he posted it on a message board at work. If you're having trouble dealing with ghosts, try spraying Febreze in your room. The story went wild through the office. Overnight, Shibata was the Febreze exorciser. The story was then told on the Fatal Frame 2 website, where it spread through the internet and became a fable, a myth, that Febreze could eliminate ghosts. It became so popular that more than a decade later, Shibata Makoto's own son would relate the story to him, not knowing it was his father who was the origin of the rumor. The man wrote an article on the subject this year, reminiscing about the strange events and even stranger rumors that came after. After the PS2 release, the team would once again consider the possibility of improving upon the game with an Xbox port. While part of the team worked on planning for a third sequel, another would work on what Kikuchi called Fatal Frame 2.5, a far more extensive port than the first game had, including new game modes, new costumes, enhanced graphics and lighting, and Dolby Digital surround sound. He'd always wanted to try a fully first-person game. Given the shooter game roots of their camera system, he thought it would be interesting to have a first-person shooter Fatal Frame, something that would increase the realism and the fear. He'd been studying how to do it, but had little to draw from in the early years. The best example he could draw from at the time was Halo. But since Halo focused on open areas, it was hard to adapt the style to the enclosed, restrictive structures of Fatal Frame. After Fatal Frame 2 was finished, he decided to revisit the idea, and the first-person mode was created for Fatal Frame 2 on Xbox. It would also include the survival mode of gameplay, another idea Kikuchi had been curious to try before fully moving on to the third installment in their series. They knew it would be a trilogy, after all. The sequel had been a greater success, and it had been an independent story, so there was clearly an opportunity to create a third title, one that the team felt would likely be the final part. Shibata already had plenty of ideas percolating in his mind during Fatal Frame 2. He had a color scheme, a monochrome and cold-feeling setting, and a blue tattoo violating the skin. In particular, the image of a female tattooed priestess. Perhaps pulling directly from his many years of haunting visions at night, the third game would be centered upon dreams, and the boundaries between not just the living and dead, but the sleeping and the awake. He even jokes about it in interviews. Years of strange dreams led him to keep a notebook at his bedside and write notes when he awoke, and those notes led over time to the creation of Himuro Mansion and Minakami Village. Specific ghosts and events were based on things he saw in his dreams or during his childhood. When they decided to focus on dreams as a source of horror for Fatal Frame 3, Shibata was able to pull heavily on his experiences with nightmares. In an interview, he even joked that this time around, I made my very own life into a game. Kikuchi reacted to the statement with shock, prompting Shibata to say, that's a lie. I guess it's half true, though. Previous titles had focused on the fear of loneliness. This time, the game would be focused on the fear of invasion, of dreams overcoming your waking hours, of a tattoo taking over your skin, of a presence attacking from the inside out. Tattoos have a turbulent history in Japan. Political and social history has given tattooing a criminal and socially immoral aspect, which has lent itself well to the fictional genres of crime and horror. The 1948 novel The Tattoo Murder Case pulled upon the public's awe and horror of full-body tattoos in its tale of intrigue and violence, and it propelled the author, Takagi Akimitsu, to fame and critical success. In the Japanese subconscious, the tattoo itself, as a symbol of criminals, foreigners, and the social outcasts, becomes a mark of the devil. The fear of invasion via tattoo becomes a very real fear of rejection and isolation from society, making this fear especially well designed to hit a Japanese audience hard. The tattoo wouldn't always be present, however. It was to be a cursed tattoo, which could move and fade in and out, a visual effect that was achieved using multi-map, a programming technique that can store multiple different values in the same variable. In Shibata's words, the tattooed skin and normal skin are variable and controlled by several conditions. For example, ghosts appear more tattooed when they're upset or they attack, and the player will see the most horrible tattooed figure when they shoot a picture of the ghosts. This specific tattoo has an especially eerie design. The snake is a symbol of divinity, a messenger of the gods in Japanese tradition, and the holly plant is a symbol of pain, referring here to the pain of living your life, in Shibata's words. That would be the central element of their story, pain and suffering. The main character's lover would die. That was the starting point of the story's development. Shibata wanted to get back to their roots, to focus on horror above all. The first game had been a struggle to create the atmosphere of a haunting. The second game to write a good story in that style of setting. This time, having fully gotten their bearings, it was time to take everything they'd learned and make it more intense, more frightening, more horrifying. They would pursue the Japanese flavor of horror, using a game system that forces the player to actively face their fears, something that was simply frightening, a stronger kind of horror. The idea of waking up to a changed world, such as seeing a person who wasn't there before, wasn't a kind of fear they'd explored yet. Shibata wanted to experiment with it now, with the helplessness of being asleep and the fear of being unable to avoid your dreams. To do that, they created two worlds, the sleeping and waking, allowing the player to navigate between the two. The team hadn't used an ordinary setting for the series before. The real world was a normal house, but while it was normal, the hauntings were in no way limited to the dream realm. Over time, the nightmares would invade the peaceful world, creating a new scenario for fear. The use of dreams gave them a unique way to balance their experience. They'd often heard the games were too much, too hard, too frightening, so now they had a built-in safety system, a place to retreat to if it became too much. Experienced players could jump in and play as much as they wanted. Frightened players could escape to the real world for a breather if they needed. It was a compromise, and one that even heightened the sense of facing your fears, because the player had to choose to enter the dream, and they knew what that choice would mean. The team had spent a long time thinking about fear. More than ever, Kikuchi believed fear was psychological. The imagination creates the scariest things in the players' minds. When you see something bad, you may have this feeling of disgust, maybe the feeling of tension when walking alone in a graveyard, maybe even the feeling you could be cursed. These feelings all pull from the same place, that primal psychological fear that Fatal Frame 3 would tap into. Kikuchi divides fear into 3 elements combined into one: space, story, and directing. The space refers to the location. It has to be a place designed to be so frightening that just being there is enough to disturb you. Then the story has to help build and create the feelings of fear. Directing refers to the camera work and cinematics, to how the story is presented and framed. Perfect these 3 elements, balance them, and you have the recipe for the most frightening experience imaginable. An experience Kikuchi calls interactive fear, one that is unique to video games. This time, the ghosts would be even stronger. The parameter algorithm, which controlled the ghosts, was altered, so that any ghost the player encountered becomes stronger upon a second and third encounter. To balance this, there were fewer battles overall, focusing on quality over quantity. The general sense was the first game was too hard, while the second was a little too easy because of the ghosts' slower approach. In 3, they would take the strength and weaknesses of the 2 previous games and balance them out. The team added more polygons to their designs, especially their faces, and each was designed as if they were their own boss creature. Every ghost had its own facial expressions, which would often change just at the moment when the camera shutter clicked. Using a variety of alpha blending parameters, a technique that alters translucency, the team created a specific blend of effects for each and every ghost. For the tattooed priestess, they created an effect that made it look as if the tattoo was floating off her body while she moved. Other ghosts appeared to shine or to be melting and blurred. Not every ghost had alpha blending, however. Closer to the beginning, the ghosts were more solid and normal in appearance. The flashlight would also have a new technique, cone lighting, which was used to create a humid and dusty atmosphere before adding a glow to give it an ethereal effect. These were new techniques to Fatal Frame, and Shibata felt these subtle additions added to the ethereal, haunted Japanese horror and beauty of the game. The central location, the Manor of Sleep, had multiple inspirations. The first location they designed was the courtyard. Early on, they developed and collected ideas of places that would be frightening, that they would want to avoid, and put them together into the chaotic manor. To emphasize the dreamlike and fantasy elements, they purposefully worked to create a layout and design that was nonsensical and confusing to navigate. Early in production, they took a trip to Tono in the Aware prefecture of Tohoku to research locations, and much of the game would reflect what they found there. Most memorably, a room that was decorated floor to ceiling with Oshira-sama dolls. As they were taking pictures, Shibata told the team, "I want a room like this." The house was also inspired by memories of Shibata's childhood, of an old abandoned house in his parents' neighborhood, a Japanese-style home verging on collapse. After school, he would explore the abandoned building, finding it full of trash and strange holes, and it was always dark, even during the day. He and his friends made a game of exploring and finding evidence to take home with them. One person had to go in alone, find a piece of evidence, and bring it back out, where they would decide what the story was, how the evidence had been left behind. To Shibata, there was something invisible wandering the house, and he feared he would be killed if it found him, so he always hid as much as he could to avoid capture. The last time he visited the house, he saw a strange spirit, a white-haired old lady pushing a stroller at speed through the halls of the house. He never went back, and a ghost designed after this old lady would appear in the third game. The memory of not just the house, but the game itself inspired Shibata. Every title had a focus on finding notes to learn more about the world, but Fatal Frame 3 would take it further, creating a fragmentary note style that allowed the players to find pieces of a story, which they would have to puzzle out the answer to. Instead of direct storytelling, the player would be handled bits and pieces of info that stimulate the imagination, allowing them to imagine what terrors must have led to the events of the game. Some of this information would even be incorrect. reflecting how people in real life often make assumptions and misunderstand information, and pass that information to others. The player would have to take in and parse everything for themselves and try to piece it together. Horror should ultimately be a story of chaos, Shibata says. You never know what is right, and nothing is logical. It's a really bad feeling, and I wanted to create this feeling in the game. The previous Fatal Frame games both had young teen girls as their protagonists, based on cultural traditions that associated both youth and femininity with spiritual power. This time, however, the team felt an older protagonist was necessary. For one, Shibata had the idea of the tattoo, and the idea of tattooing seemed to fit an older protagonist. For another, Kikuchi wanted this story to focus on pain and suffering, and felt an older woman would have been alive long enough to face such a pain and overcome it. Originally, the protagonist was around 26, but given the very young age of most Japanese protagonists, it was changed to 23. She should be a beautiful, mature woman, in Kikuchi's words, someone strong enough to face destiny and endure the pain of her lover's death. This time, the loss that was central to the story had already happened, and in a realistic, natural way the audience could relate to. A younger person's sadness is different in its youth. A grown person who has learned to shoulder loss and keep living has a different kind of suffering entirely. The protagonist would be very real, yet trapped in a strange, unreal scenario. Her name became Rei, playing with the word central to the Fatal Frame series. The symbol for zero in Japanese can also be read as Rei. Her colors, much like the palette of the entire game, were blacks and blues, colors associated with darkness, water, and sorrow. But while Rei would be the central character, she wouldn't be the only playable one. For the first time, the game would have not one or two, but 3 playable characters, each designed to emphasize a different experience of isolation and fear. Each character would have a specialty, meant to give the player more to work with during gameplay. A new character, Kei, would be the first playable male character, which presented some difficulties. So far, their idea of spiritual beings drew on femininity and youth, so they carefully balanced creating a feminine man who wasn't too feminine, but they also wanted to avoid masculine belligerence. This was a game about being afraid, not punching ghosts. So Kei became a slender but not feminine character, designed to fit the world of Fatal Frame. But overall, they didn't actually worry too much about his design. By comparison, the team was incredibly detailed and focused for both Miku and Rei. Originally, Rei's central outfit was a skirt, but female team members suggested a change because, quote, pants are cool. After comparing the designs, the team agreed the pants were overwhelmingly superior. They also had to develop night clothes, given the themes of the game. Shibata would very sheepishly apologize in one interview about Miku's night clothes, saying, "I'm sorry. Miku's night clothes were all my own personal interests, so please forgive me. I really just wanted her to wear them." Since night clothes were involved, the clothing designs for this game went absolutely crazy, in Kikuchi and Shibata's words. They had to thin them out over time, but at various points they had Rei in a sexy casino dealer outfit, and Kei in a black bondage suit. These did not make the cut. At one point, Shibata even sent Kikuchi an email asking, "How about this?" with an image of Rei in her underwear. Kikuchi replied, "I'm begging you, please change that to a skirt." The reply email said, "Is this satisfactory?" and included an image with a see-through skirt. That one didn't make the cut either. Along with the human protagonist, there was one more addition, a cat. It was at Kikuchi's insistence. A black cat in a Japanese ghost story. How perfect would it be? He had lots of plans for the cat, given its relevance to the genre, and he felt it would add something to the experience to have a living creature that wasn't a ghost or a human moving in the world. The cat's name, Ruri, is Japanese for lapis lazuli, a stone with special importance in Buddhist traditions. Depending on the school of thought, it's associated with medicine, healing, the color blue, and provides protection from negative influences. At one point, the game included ghosts only the cat could see, or places that could be photographed only by following Ruri's gaze. They even considered making a Ruri model camera designed to resemble holding a cat. To take photos, you'd press on the cat's head. It would meow and snap a picture. They never did create it, tragically. The sounds of Fatal Frame 3 would focus on creating a cold, damp atmosphere, and was meant to convey a more environmental experience than a musical one. It was only when the player returned to the real world that background music would play, reinforcing the sense of differentiation between the dreams and the real world. For this game, the voices of the young ghosts would actually be done by a child performer, a 10-year-old girl named Suzuhara Miyu. Even Shibata found it scary when she said her lines during recording, calling it freaky. Amano Suki would return to create music for the third game, and this time she was ready. After receiving the initial documents on the game, she got to work creating Koi, meaning voice, the third game's theme. All the while, director Shibata had been afraid she wouldn't have a full picture of the game, and started writing a detailed explanation of the game's message. But before he could even hand it over to her, she said, "I've actually finished it already." Previous games in the series had multiple endings, some of which had caused controversy and conflicted opinions among fans. This time, there would just be one real ending, based on whether the player finished certain goals. Kikuchi felt if the story had a clear enough message, then only one ending was best. They had a narrative running, a story themed on loss and grief, and the ending needed to conclude in a cathartic way. Kikuchi framed it as a bad-to-good narrative. The death had already occurred before the game's events, so it could only get better from then on. At the end, it all becomes zero. It evens out, and the player, and Rei, is left with a fresh start. Originally, the ending Shibata wrote was 13 minutes long. It was far too long, but one element that was cut was preserved as a photograph that appears in the true ending. He really wanted to include a floating slideshow of photographs Rei had taken that reflected her feelings and her loss, but it just didn't happen. Over the years, the Fatal Frame team had experienced countless strange things. At the behest of their director, they had avoided the traditional Japanese protections most companies involved in ghost stories would undertake, such as ritual purifications. At the beginning of Fatal Frame 3, Shibata was finally convinced to allow for purification, and even attended one himself around New Year's of that year. It unfortunately backfired. He became very ill afterwards, and when he returned to the office, the strange illness spread to half a dozen others. So did the half-joking rumor that the purification must have hurt director Shibata because he was in fact some kind of cursed, haunted being. More than that, the equipment for developing the game got sick, machinery started breaking, and even more bizarre things started happening. It seemed Fatal Frame couldn't escape the ghostly realm. During voice recording, the voice actor kept hearing knocking at the door, and from the ceiling overhead. No one else could hear it, despite how long it went knocking. The sound manager S, likely Atsuo Saito, possibly the same poor sound manager who's been referenced in countless Fatal Frame ghost stories. He awoke to a loud crash in the middle of the night. A glass cabinet door broke in his room, but what made no sense was that the glass was inside his futon when he woke up. One woman found strange white handprints on the walls of the woman's bathroom. A woman N from the CG team kept hearing footsteps when the office was empty late at night. This was a running theme. Many of the team members had to work late hours and often complained of hearing strange noises when no one was there, or when they were trying to nap at the office, including shadows in the bathroom and children's footsteps. Shibata had a strange experience at home. In the middle of the night, a female voice came out of the vent in his wall, asking him to go for a swim. At the time, he was writing the ending of the game, which involved an ocean separating life from death, and the strange parallel was incredibly creepy. Fans of the series online had theories about why the team was so haunted, because Shibata had in fact based some of his stories and in-game events on his ghostly experiences. Perhaps the spirits themselves might be auditioning to earn a role in the series. The team kept having strange experiences and kept telling the internet about them, and the internet kept eating it up in a charming kind of campfire story way. Nothing was too serious or too dreadful, just stories of the unexplained, the confusing, and the likely sleep-deprived, overworked developers reporting what they'd seen but just couldn't believe. During an interview around this time, Shibata was asked what to do if you encountered a ghost. He answered honestly, "I can give no advice. I myself am really scared every time I see one, and you cannot predict when you'll have an encounter. I once saw a ghost who had a damaged face. I couldn't figure out if it was a he or a she. I was kind of panicked, so I pretended I was dead." Fatal Frame 3 released in Japan and Hong Kong at the end of August in 2005, during the month of the year most associated with the supernatural in the East. It made its way to America and Canada that November, and to the countries of Europe, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and Portugal, the year after. It also released in Australia and for a first time in South Africa in 2006. The game debuted at 5th place on the Famitsu Top 30 charts. Within 2 weeks, it sold about 55,000 units. By the end of 2005, that number would reach 70,000, making it one of the top 200 best-selling games of the year. Little else is known of its sales around the time, though Tecmo records seem to indicate it performed to their expectations. Once again, it received a Best Of label in Japan and 2 reprintings. Yet strangely, the release of a Korean version seems to have been skipped. According to Korean sites, only the first 2 games were ever officially released, which was likely part of why the sales from Fatal Frame 2 to Fatal Frame 3 were slightly lower, because the series was so popular in South Korea. Still, the series had done well. It had retained growth, improving and expanding with each game, addressing fan concerns and general audience retention. They did everything they possibly could do to improve, and in a genre that's hard to keep alive during a time when horror games in general tended to struggle. That Fatal Frame survived and even thrived, and came to an end because the team chose to conclude their story, not because of budget cuts or restructuring or commands from above, is a miraculous tale in its own right. Fatal Frame 3 was an ending. Not the end, but an end. The team knew it at the time. Shibata felt this was the last Fatal Frame, at least for now. If ever another would occur, it would be on another console generation further down the line. He was right. Another game would come, but by then, much would have changed. The next Fatal Frame would be a Japanese-only release on the Wii in 2008, and only a year later, the company would merge with another to become Koei Tecmo. Many members of the Project Zero team, some of whom had worked on all or most of the games, would not return in later years. Many of them left Tecmo around the time of the merger. For Fatal Frame, the coming years would be a slow shift from a PlayStation era to a Nintendo era. Inari Daisuke, the CG movie editor who came to oversee much of Fatal Frame's cutscenes and in-game movies, would be one of the few to remain at Koei and return for all the later games. He also worked on the Neo series and Dead or Alive. Eventually, he would leave to work for Square Enix, where he participated in Dissidia NT, before leaving once again in 2020 to join the smaller Craft Egg company. Here, he helped kickstart the company's CG division, a role that led to his receiving the award for Best Leader at Craft Egg that year. Shibata Kohei would remain and continue as project manager, overseeing many of Tecmo's titles, big and small. During the Wii years, he had the stroke of inspiration that led to Super Swing Golf, a title that used the Wiimote as a real golf club. He was the producer behind Undead Knights on the PSP, a title where the player was the bad guy, who could turn his enemies into zombies and recruit them, as well as throw them at opponents. An interviewer discussing the game with Shibata Kohei and Kikuchi Kisuke commented on this trend of evil heroes in Tecmo games like Deception, and Kikuchi joked, "Well, both Shibatas like evil. Shibata Makoto and Shibata Kohei, they like evil." I balance it out because I'm good. By 2009, Shibata Kohei was a producer working alongside Kikuchi as part of Team Tachyon, appearing at conventions to help promote Tecmo games. As of 2020, he was still employed there. His last credit is as project manager on Nioh 2. Hasegawa Hitoshi also became a project manager and producer over time, appearing on the same stage at conventions as Shibata Kohei and Kikuchi Kisuke. He took over leadership of Team Ninja after Itagaki left, before eventually leaving to help establish Kadokawa Games around 2006. There, he would be creative supervisor for Lollipop Chainsaw, project manager for Killer is Dead, and eventually would direct his own games. Rodea the Sky Soldier in 2015, which was an unfortunately less than successful Wii U game, and Root Letter in 2016, a mystery-themed visual novel that was a surprise hit, which has been re-released on the Switch. His last mainstream game would be The Lost Child in 2017, which he helped pioneer with two other industry vets, Takayasu Sawaki, director and creator of El Shaddai, and Kaneko Kazuma, concept artist for the Shin Megami Tensei series. One day, a realization came to him while watching his young son, an elementary school student, while he was playing games. He realized it was the young people who were in the games industry now who would make the games his adult son would play in the future. It was time to let the youth shine. In 2019, after 25 years in the industry, he retired, but he didn't quit working entirely. With some old friends from the Chinese games industry, he created 91 Act, a company whose name is a synonym in Japanese for taking action. On the Japanese side, he was a representative for Hyde Co., helping develop phone games in Japan. With his many connections and years of experience, he hoped to help shepherd the younger generation, to teach those coming up in the games industry, and make way for their future careers. Shidara Masahiro, longtime friend of Hasegawa Hitoshi, followed his friend from Tecmo and helped establish Kadokawa Games beside him, where he was producer on Lollipop Chainsaw. From then on, he had countless unique opportunities, collaborating with television stations to make DS games and anime companies to make kids games. In 2019, he created his own company, Udeki Kikao Co., where he remains representative director. Iuchi Tsuyoshi began as a game planner, but according to his own words, he was mostly involved in the scenario and texts of the first three games. Recollecting Fatal Frame 3 on Twitter, he remarked that Ray's materials were nostalgic for him, but he just couldn't bear to reread what he wrote. He would be one of the few to remain at Tecmo and continue working on Fatal Frame. Takasaki Toshiyuki would also remain at Tecmo. He worked alongside Iuchi and Hasegawa on projects for Tecmo's Levo division, which focused on online games like Monster Farm Online. He was in charge of the Bastard online game, before leaving in 2010 to create Dino Entertainment, a smartphone game company. More than a decade later, the company is still standing, with Takasaki at the helm. Asami Kenichi was a game programmer who may have been the man behind Fatal Frame 3's game engine. He was the game's main programmer, and in an interview years later, he discussed his work as a game engine creator and his early career working on game engines for Tecmo, before moving to Bandai Namco in 2020. He now works with a small, relaxed team, and his goal is to keep working on site for as long as his strength lasts, in the hopes of creating a game engine that might be used to create a big new title. Fatal Frame is the seminal work of fiction about death. It's a hard and complex topic to tackle. How do you handle the grief, the terror, the repulsion, alongside the beauty, the hilarity, the absurdity? Death is as complex as the life that it ends. As people, we make light of death, even as we live our lives in constant fear of it. We use gallows humor, we laugh at absurd stories of strange ways people's lives have ended, and we also feel great grief and sorrow at loss, even for strangers and those distant to us. Very few stories are able to embrace how incredibly varied death is, and how complex our own feelings about death really are. Fatal Frame does that across a trio of games that expresses the fear and beauty, the loss and grief, the peace and contentment, the comedy and the joy that death can bring. And so much of that spirit comes from the team that made it, led by the incredibly unique duo at the helm, Kikuchi Kisuke and Shibata Makoto. While over time Kikuchi's role would shift, his influence was nonetheless felt. He commented in an interview how his increasingly managerial oversight role left him less time working directly on the games, but that Shibata knew his own thought processes so well, it was likely his own thinking still influenced each title. But of course, the game would never be quite the same without Shibata Makoto. No one else could say with confidence he would build a game based off his dreams, that he could recreate the experience of being haunted with a game console, that would pine to be haunted by a pretty ghost. More than anyone, he seems to understand the fear and beauty, the horror and hilarity of death, and it's made so incredibly clear in every interview in which he manages to frighten his co-workers with stories only to turn around and laugh when he reveals he's made it up. There's no better way to end the video than to conclude with the man's own words. One of the reasons I pay attention to the details of the game is that dead people are watching the game while you are playing. I know it, and dead people care about the details. This game is also for dead people, and I can proudly show it to them. Thanks to everyone for watching, the living and the dead.